Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Community Law and Mediation's webinar in preparation for the Climate Action Plan Consultation 2023. We're really delighted this morning to be joined by expert guest speakers, Dr. Louise Fitzgerald and Professor McMullin. But before I hand over to our expert speakers, I want to provide just a little bit of context about why this consultation is happening and what the Climate Action Plan actually is. So I'm just going to briefly share a couple of slides. Okay, so first of all, my name is Clodagh Daly and I'm manager of Community Law and Mediation's Centre for Environmental Justice. So the Climate Action Plan 2023 consultation is happening in the context of Ireland's emissions remaining very high and continuing to increase. So in February of this year, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change published a report concluding that states are not taking the necessary action to protect communities from either present or future harms caused by climate change. The report was described by the United Nations Secretary General as an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. But the same report also recognized that climate action can be an instrument to generate opportunities for the most disadvantaged, to reduce social injustices, and to improve people's well-being, quality of life, and access to rights across regions of the world. So in other words, while climate change can be a threat multiplier, climate action can become a justice multiplier. So it's in this context that we are preparing for the annual Climate Action Plan consultation. Ireland's climate law requires the government to reduce its emissions 51% by 2030 compared to 2018 levels. And the climate law requires the government to do this by implementing 5-year carbon budgets. So carbon budgets are essentially where a limit is placed on the total number of emissions that can be permitted over a period of time to remain within a temperature threshold. And so the carbon budgets were adopted by the government and came into effect in April of this year. And then what's known as the sectoral emissions ceilings. So the division or the allocation of the carbon budget between various sectors came into effect in July. And so the Climate Action Plan is intended to provide a framework as to how the 51% reductions in emissions between now and 2030 will actually be achieved. However, as we're going to hear from our expert speakers, there are really significant issues with the carbon budget and the sectoral emission ceilings, which will need to be addressed if the Climate Action Plan is to be successful. So how can you have your say? So climate action plans obviously work best when they are informed by people rather than by vested interests. And this year there are 2 consultations on the Climate Action Plan. The first is the climate conversations, and this is directed to individuals and communities, and everybody can have their say in this one. And the second is the call for expert evidence. So this is directed towards grassroots organizations, NGOs, and others in academia and elsewhere. So first of all, the climate conversations is a survey, and I'll share the link to the survey in the chat box in a moment. You don't need to be an expert on climate change or on climate action to answer this. It contains 5 sections, and the first 4 sections are going to ask about yourself, who you think is responsible for climate action, how much you understand about climate change, and how much people and communities can get involved. The 5th section then looks at climate action across different areas or sectors. And again, you don't need to answer all the questions in this. You can just respond to the questions you feel you know most about. So the deadline for participating in this survey is this Friday, so September the 9th. So you can even be filling it out as we're going through this webinar, and our speakers will provide some context as to how you might inform your answers there. So the second consultation is the call for expert evidence. So this is directed towards groups and organizations that are working in some way on climate justice. So if you are involved with or working with an organization that has been working on things like advocating for Ireland to transition away from fossil fuels, coming up with solutions to energy poverty, calling for workers and community rights to be protected through a just transition, then you should have your say in the call for expert evidence. And so the format for this is a series of questions. And the approach that community law and mediation is taking is just selecting the questions that are most relevant to us, rather than trying to respond to the entire consultation because it's very lengthy. So the deadline to this consultation is the 20th of September at 5:30, and you can email your response to callforevidence@decc.gov.ie. And again, I'll share that in the chat box in a moment. And so what should you say in the consultation? Well, we're very lucky to be joined by expert speakers who are going to provide us some context for that today. But there are a couple of key points that we think you should bear in mind when answering the consultation. The first is that we need to see deep, urgent, and sustained reductions in emissions. That means we need to transition away from fossil fuels and to prioritize energy efficiency. Secondly, we need to address energy poverty. Nobody in Ireland should be making the choice between either eating or heating. And then finally, we need a climate action plan that prioritizes social justice. We need to see the interests and voices of affected workers and communities prioritized, and no one should be left behind. So I'm delighted now to hand over to our expert speakers who are going to focus on the need for the climate action plan to deliver urgent and deep reductions in emissions and a just transition. And their insights will help inform you and/or your organization's response to this consultation. Professor Barry McMullin is professor at the DCU School of Engineering, and his current academic focus is on climate change and in particular radical emissions reductions. He is co-PI on the EPA-funded research project investigating the potential for negative emissions technologies in Ireland. Dr. Louise Fitzgerald is a political scientist with a particular interest in the societal dimension of sustainability transitions. Her research focuses on how to develop policies for just transitions, but especially on inclusive policy design for fairer, more accepted and successful climate policy. If you have questions during the webinar, I'd ask you to please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And if you see a question there that's similar to one you'd like to ask, please give that question a thumbs up and we'll have a designated section for Q&As at the end. So thanks everyone, and I'll hand over to Barry to get us started.
Thanks very much, Clodagh. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to join you this morning. This is an important set of consultations, and you know, one can get consultation fatigue, and it's not always clear how much listening is done on the other side of these consultations. But the one thing that we can be confident of is that if you don't put your point of view into this consultation, it definitely won't be listened to. So while it is a bit of a chore, it really is important that the diversity of voices get heard here. And it also helps, you know, those people within government who are trying to advocate for stronger climate action, if they can point at input that is supporting that, then that strengthens their position in making that argument internally in government. So it really is very important. I'm just going to take a short time to provide some contextual overview from my perspective on what, you know, how this particular consultation, this particular activity of updating the climate action plan, how it fits into the overall national framework of climate action, and how that articulates with global climate action as well. And I'm not going to be prescriptive. I'm not going to, you know, say you should say this, or this in your own submissions. Obviously, you make your own mind up about that, but you'll probably pick up on some implications nonetheless of what my own views are. So we're operating under a new statutory framework for climate action in Ireland since the amendment last year to the original 2015 Act. So we've got the Climate Action Low Carbon Development Act 2015 as amended in 2021. And that created a new framework for governance of domestic climate action based on so-called carbon budgets. Carbon budgets are just the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted in Ireland over a specified period of time. And in our framework, it's divided up into 5-year periods starting in 2021. So the first 5-year carbon budget period, we're already about a third of the way through. It goes from 2021 to 2025. The second one, 2026, 2030. Third one, 5 years after that. And it's a rolling 15-year cycle. So we're currently looking 15 years ahead. That will be updated in the next year or two to add a budget for 2036 to 2040 and so on. Why does it make sense to have this sort of budget approach? Well, for carbon dioxide in particular, but also for other long-lived greenhouse gases, what determines how warm the planet gets, which is what determines how severe the disruption to our planetary systems is the cumulative amount, the total amount of those gases in the atmosphere. And for long-lived gases, once we put them in the atmosphere, and by long-lived, we're talking thousands to tens of thousands of years. Okay, it's not a human lifetime. We are doing things now that are changing the planet essentially in geological time scales. And so these long-lived gases, once we put them in the atmosphere, they stay there, for practical purposes forever. So there's and the amount of warming we get depends directly on how much of these gases we put in the atmosphere. And it's an almost direct relationship. The more we emit ever, the higher the temperature will get. So if we're going to limit the amount of temperature rise we get, we have to limit the total amount we put in the atmosphere. At some point, we have to stop putting more in the atmosphere. If we put too much in the atmosphere, at that point, we actually have to start trying to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, which is going to be incredibly difficult. But we've probably already gone so far that is going to be necessary if we can possibly find the societal cohesion and coherence in the face of unfolding disruptions and conflict to actually do that. So it's a very volatile and uncertain global period of time we're now venturing into in this century. So that's the motivation for having a budget system. At some point, Ireland has to stop putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The current idea is that could be as late as 2050. For the record, I believe that's way too late. Okay, from a global point of view, 2050 might be okay. Well, okay is pretty bad, but might just about be tolerable. But within that global, no more from 2050 onwards, the countries that have most historical responsibility, most capacity to act, most per capita emissions, they need to act fastest. So a country like Ireland, in my opinion, needs to stop adding to the burden much earlier than 2050, probably 2040 or 2035, we possibly can. But the budgets basically say between now and when we get to the point where we're not putting any more in the atmosphere, how much in total will we allow ourselves? And we're operating under this so-called Paris Agreement for International Collaboration. The Paris Agreement is a terrible agreement. The only good thing about the Paris Agreement is that it's the only agreement we have. It actually is an international agreement, but it's actually very, very weak, and we desperately need much stronger international mechanisms to address climate change. I might come back to that at the end. But it is all we've got. And the architecture of the Paris Agreement relies on bottom-up voluntary action by all the countries participating. So it relies on countries like Ireland voluntarily saying, thus far and no further, we will take this much of the global carbon budget, as it's called, for a given temperature rise, which is 1.5 degrees, and we may blow through 1.5 degrees. But if we do, that doesn't mean that we suddenly go, oh, well, that's a pity, we'll aim for 2 degrees instead. It means we have to get back to 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is not safe. 1.1, 1.2 degrees over pre-industrial, which is where we are today, is not safe. People are dying. Okay, we've already breached the objectives of the original UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was to prevent dangerous climate change. We're already living, well, we're living with climate change. People in the global south are dying with climate change. That is already the situation we're in. So it's the urgency cannot be overstated here. So the new act is great. I mean, in terms of bottom up, it's actually world leading. We are voluntarily saying, yes, we're going to limit our total emissions at some point. We haven't quite, 2050, before 2050, we haven't quite said how much our emissions will be between now and 2050, but the council did some analysis that went some way towards characterizing that. So we've made some progress on that. And for the next 15 years, at least, we've got a tentative, well, this is the maximum amount we're going to release in the next 15 years. And that's divvied up into 3 5-year periods. And that's been adopted. It was up to the Climate Council recommended what those numbers should be, but then it's up to the Oireachtas to actually adopt them, and they were adopted back in February. So those numbers are there. Now, how forceful are they? The obligations under the Act are just for the ministers and the government collectively to do everything that's practicable to limit emissions within those budgets. But, that's still a test. Are they doing what's practical to do that? And the Ukraine war and the energy crisis have also obviously disrupted that, made it harder in some ways, made it easier in other ways. We'll have to see how it all pans out. But the budgets are adopted, and you see an awful lot of talk, indeed, almost a fixation on this commitment that was in the programme for government of a 51% reduction in emissions by 2030, which is an interesting number in many ways. We could go back through the history of where that number came from, but that was just saying what the annual emissions in 2030 should be relative to, well, it turned out in the Act to be relative to 2018, 51% reduction in annual emissions by 2030, relative to 2018. That was the programme for government commitment. And that still gets trotted out repeatedly as if that is still what we're working towards. It isn't. Okay. And it wasn't a good, it wasn't a well-formulated objective anyway, because that doesn't say anything about what the cumulative emissions between now or between the start of this government and 2030 will be. And it's the cumulative emissions, it's the total amount over the 10 years. Not just what we're emitting in 2030, it matters. And that's why the Act created the carbon budget system, the 5-year carbon budget system, because it's the cumulative amount. And now that we've got those cumulative limits set, a budget for 2021 to 2025 and a separate budget for 2026 to 2030, that's the target, or the target is the wrong word. It's not aspirational. That's the constraint. That's what the government are supposed to be working to. That could easily mean that we need to have deeper reductions than 51% in the year 2030. And if so, so be it. That's what the Act says. We now have to comply with the budgets. The 51% is no longer the operational guide to policy. Okay, so how is this supposed to be done in practice? The governance framework is that we have a climate action plan. The government has to publish a climate action plan, which is supposed to explain the actions that are necessary to credibly limit emissions within these budgets. Now, the very first climate action plan predated in 2019, the current Act, but the first climate action plan under the current Act was the Climate Action Plan 2021, but it was published a year ago, more or less, before the budgets had been adopted. Okay, so it wasn't really able to speak directly to the budgets, so it was still heuristically using this idea of 51% in 2030 and some sort of trajectory towards that. But now we have the budgets. So the update to the Climate Action Plan, which should have been done within calendar year 2022, it's supposed to be annual, but they've taken so long to get to this point that it looks like it's, they're now calling it Climate Action Plan 2023, so it's going to drift into 2023. But this is really the first climate action plan under the new Act. This is the climate action plan that has to be tied to the budgets. And the first budget, we're already a third of the way through. So really early actions to meet the very significant reductions that are necessary within the next 3 and a bit years of the first budget period. We need to see details on that. It's not all about 2030. We've got a constraint between now and the end of 2025 that is very severe, and we need to see meaningful actions towards that. The second part of the governance is the so-called sectoral emission ceilings. So the idea of the sectoral emission ceilings is if you've got an overall national budget, then you need to say, well, where are those emissions going to arise across the economy? In what sectors? What are basically the limits within each sector so that they add up to a number that's less than or equal to the overall budget? I say less than or equal to. You might think it just has to be equal to. But if you allocate all the budget to the sectors, then if any sector goes over budget, you blow the national budget. So it would be much more prudent to make the total of the allocations a little bit less, to have some contingency reserve so that you can be confident you'll meet the budget. That's what any normal budget process would involve. And I say those sectoral emission ceilings are absolutely central to driving the updated climate action plan. I'll just share my screen briefly. So at the end of July, the government announced sectoral emission ceilings, except it didn't. Okay, if you read down through this, they're still talking about the overall target of 51% reduction by 2030, as if that is the target. It isn't. It's the budgets that are now the targets. And the process is supposed to be sectoral ceilings for each 5-year period. But they didn't give sectoral ceilings for each 5-year period. They only give ceilings for the year 2030. And that doesn't tell us what we need to know in order to devise the measures that are necessary within each 5-year period. Secondly, they left out one sector, the so-called LULUCF, land use change and forestry sector. They said they're undertaking a major review of land use, and so it would be premature to set a sectoral ceiling for that sector. But premature or not, we've got a budget that only has 3 and a bit years to run. We can't meaningfully attempt to meet that budget if we don't set a limit in all sectors. So even though we might have to come back to revisit that, say, for the period from 2026 to 2030 in the light of a review of the situation, for the immediate budget period, we need some limit on LULUCF emissions. You can't just leave a sector out, otherwise we don't know whether it adds up, and the Act requires it to add up. Secondly, not only did they leave a prudential contingency reserve, they actually adopted a negative contingency reserve. They referred to what they called unallocated emissions reductions, and they put a number on it. Now, it still wasn't a number tied to budget periods, but that's crazy. That's planning to fail. So this whole sectoral emission ceiling process has not unfolded the way it should have, and that's a serious problem. Okay, I'm about to run out of time, and I'm going to hand over. I hope that has given you some context. Obviously, you can only make your submissions in the light of what the government has said to date, but that fact that they're not in a timely way implementing what the Act requires is really problematic in my view. But the parting thoughts, what actually matters to the climate is not what happens in Ireland, it's what happens globally. So the point I mentioned earlier, Irish climate action will only, Irish climate mitigation, limiting temperature rise, will only make a difference, a material difference, if we leverage that to influence other much bigger countries. But in the climate action plan to date, there's no mention, there's no coherent agenda, there's no strategy for how Ireland is going to use its own ambitious climate action to actually engage really seriously in the way we engage with Brexit, with all our European partners. We need a huge diplomatic effort. And if we don't do that, then in terms of climate impacts, it doesn't matter what we do here. We're so small, it won't be material. That is absolutely true. We should do what's right. That's ethical. But in order for it to be effective, we need to leverage that into international action. And the last thing I would say, and it comes back to the justice issue, there's a huge debate about whether we can make the required emissions reductions while maintaining the current level of material economy that we have, the current level of resource use, the current level of turnover, the consumerist economies that we have. Now, I'm frankly, just as an engineer, I can't see any way that we can get emissions down globally or in an industrial country like Ireland fast enough without contracting the level of material turnover, energy and material turnover, the consumer economy, in other words. But contracting that in a way that's fair and just and equitable is very, very difficult. It falls under the domain of what's called degrowth. But I think we need a conversation about that. And even if one only suggested in this consultation that that should be an element of the national conversation, I think that would be helpful. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much. Back to Clodagh.
Thanks, Barry. That was such an interesting and really important points that you raised as well. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Louise Fitzgerald. I noticed that the questions have started coming into the Q&A box, so please do carry on with that. And I think someone in the audience has raised their hand. If you have a question to ask, if you could put it into the Q&A box, that would be great. And then we'll have a Q&A section at the end. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Thank you, Clodagh. Thanks to the Centre and to Barry for, I think really giving a great overview of this, the scientific basis of what's going on here, the context, but also the real urgency behind the need for action. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining. So my name is Louise Fitzgerald. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Geography at Maynooth University. And my research broadly focuses on justice in environmental issues, as well as sustainability transitions. And as Clodagh said, talking about and looking at how we can develop more inclusive approaches to the transition. So I'm really grateful today to talk with you about just transition. Just to give a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. Firstly, I'm going to give an introduction to the concept of just transition and why it's important. So for those of you not necessarily familiar with it yet, then I'm going to offer a diagnosis, I think, of current issues with the transition approach in Ireland at the moment, to provide that sort of context when we're thinking about sectoral ceilings or climate action in general, in order to provide that context. And finally, I'll just outline, I think, some of what needs to happen to move towards more meaningful justice within the Irish transition, so tailored to today's focus on the consultations which are going on. So just to begin, with an introduction to just transition for those of you not yet familiar with the concept. So it first arose within the trade union movement, and broadly what just transition is about ensuring that the transition happens in a way that's inclusive, and it's often focusing on supporting communities or regions that are dependent on fossil fuel industries. So the National Economic and Social Council here in Ireland offers this definition, which is that a just transition is one which seeks to ensure the transition is fair, equitable, and inclusive in terms of processes and outcomes. So there we have both the idea that the processes have to be fair. So for example, through including impacted communities. So we think of that in terms of procedural justices, so that procedures are fair, as well as fair in terms of outcomes. So this could mean, for example, that the costs and the benefits of the transition are distributed in a way that is fair and equal and doesn't overburden particular groups in society. Some of you might be familiar with the just transition concept or have heard about it in how it's taken shape in Ireland, which has mostly been to do with the government providing funding streams that can be applied to help, for example, with retraining programs in the Midlands to help the transition away from peat industry. However, groups in the broader environmental movement, such as the Climate Justice Alliance, they would highlight how the just transition is actually deeper and broader than this. And it's really fundamentally about shifting from an extractivist to a regenerative economy. And I think this overlaps with what Barry was just talking about at the end there, of thinking about fundamentally how we organize our economy and our society. So an extractivist economy is really about trying to extract value in terms of trying to develop profit from people and nature and seeing these as resources. Whereas a regenerative economy moves away from these damaging practices, which are damaging both in terms of societal and environmental health. And really the way we would see regenerative economy coming into play would be economies much more place-based, local, communities having a more democratic say over how what happens in their areas, as well as really centering on the importance of societal and ecological well-being. So it's really about more fundamental shifts, I think, to just transition, if we're to have a meaningful transition. So really in this way, the just transition becomes a means for the redistribution of power and resources, as well as an opportunity to address previous harms and injustices that have taken place in our society. So we might understand that in terms of restorative justice. To introduce the just transition concept in a bit more detail, I just want to reflect for a moment on why I think it's important. So firstly, I think the just transition is important and we need it fundamentally because it's the right thing to do. So, you know, some people may debate this, but for those who subscribe to just transition principles, they really believe that the transition can and should be a way to address both societal and environmental harms. I think it's also the pragmatic thing to do. So really, the transition is fundamentally a societal transition, and it's really important to bring people along, in the transition and include them meaningfully for the most success in transition processes. Also to avoid the risk of protest and pushback, which I think we've had our own experience in Ireland with in regards to the transition. And then finally, groups such as Movement Generation, which is a youth environmental movement in the US, remind us that the transition is inevitable, but justice is not. So I think the impacts of the climate crisis are so clear and becoming ever more clear that essentially some sort of transition is going to happen, but there's really a choice here. And either the transition can risk causing further harm, or it can be a vehicle, as I said, for addressing past harms and injustices through including and redistributing transition benefits to groups who were traditionally marginalized in our society. So moving now to look at, in contrast, some of the current issues, I think, of approaches to the transition at the moment, and contrasting them with those just transition principles that I just looked at. So I think it's important to think about these in their important context, generally when thinking about either the consultations or climate policy in general in Ireland, because they continue to shape our dominant approaches to climate action. And they pose real risks, I think, to developing inclusive and just transitions. So all of these issues that I'm going to talk about now are interrelated and overlap, but but just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to look at them in turn. So the first is really an overlooking of the on-the-ground impacts of policy. The second is an over-reliance on market-based approaches. And finally is the lack of a full build-out of meaningful and inclusive alternatives. So just to talk about the first one, so the lack of and the overlooking of the on-the-ground impacts of policy, which are really spatially unevenly distributed and disproportionately affect certain groups and certain areas in Ireland. So I think really the on-the-ground impacts of policy are hugely underappreciated. And I think partly this comes from some approaches solely focusing just on emissions or on technological developments. So of course, climate change is about the problem of emissions in the atmosphere, and Barry really clearly outlined that for us. And technology is part of addressing this, but I think focusing mainly on these elements, as sometimes is done within policy, misunderstands the true cause of the problem, which is the system of economic and social relations, which put the emissions there in the first place. And again, Barry talked about that at the end of his talk. So it's the system that put those emissions in the atmosphere, as well as causing other social and environmental harm and damage. And I think often the societal dimension is underappreciated, which risks causing harm and undermines and underappreciates the importance of social change in addressing the sustainability challenges. Overlooking the on-the-ground impacts, I think, also risks really causing harm through transition processes, which may be well-intentioned but cause unintended consequences, and developing an overall extractive approach to how we address sustainability challenges. So I'm thinking here in particular of rural communities around Ireland impacted by large-scale developments, for example, linked to the transition, in places such as County Leitrim, which are facing many of the costs, but very few of the benefits from the renewable energy transition. I'm thinking, for example, of campaigns such as Save Dua Mountain in Northern Leitrim, which are highlighting the risks of large-scale energy projects in terms of environmental and social harm. As well as recent moves to reduce emissions from agriculture and turf, which I think have underplayed, and we saw then the impacts of that of the societal dimension. So sole focus on emissions or technology would see these developments as positive, but I think they run the risk of real harm to local communities and certain groups, going against just transition principles. The second issue, I think, related to this is the predominance of trust in market-based approaches to the transition. So this is the idea that largely the economy and market can sort out environmental issues. And so what's really needed by policymakers is some tweaking at the edges, but otherwise the market will develop solutions to the crises. I think there are a few problems with this. One is it undermines the belief that it's government intervention that's fundamentally needed to organize a just transition. Secondly, it leads to over-reliance on the private sector, whose interests are not necessarily and sometimes run directly counter to the development of more sustainable societies. Also, I think this limits perspective on the options available to us to develop a just transition and priorities of skewed priorities of what is valuable. So I think we can see, and you'll see this yourself if you read the climate, the recent climate policy documents, really this dominance of a market-based and economic approach in the dominant framing of climate action in terms of employment opportunities, innovation, enterprise, competition, efficiency, rather than, for example, framing and prioritizing societal well-being, inclusion, and regenerative practices. So overlapping then with the third issue, a lack of build out of alternatives, instruments such as carbon pricing, which have been used widely, so making fossil fuels more expensive, are really based fundamentally on the idea that you make polluting behaviors more expensive so that people shift to more sustainable options. However, as of yet, these alternatives are wholly underdeveloped in Ireland across transport, energy, farming. So the approach of making unsustainable activities more expensive in the absence of accessible alternatives will only work to increase the burden on households and communities. Much of the focus of policy is also on educating citizens and young people and engaging them for the transition. However, my sense is that far more people than is appreciated are aware of and understand sustainability issues, yet they lack the resources or access to move to more sustainable ways of living, all the more significant, of course, in the cost of living crisis. So turning now to what is needed. So firstly, I think far more reaching government intervention is needed to ensure a just and timely transition. So the transformations required are absolutely huge and really need the government to intervene and not leave it up solely to the market. So my colleague, Patrick Bresnahan and Sinead Mercier from UCD Law, just this week in the Examiner published an article outlining the clear signs that the market has failed in regard to energy. So we can see this currently as they point to the record profits of energy companies contrasted starkly with the cost of living crisis and rising energy poverty. And in this, they look to our history, such as the establishment of the ESB, and call for more public and democratic ownership of the energy system to address both societal and energy challenges and environmental challenges. So I think this is a really clear, articulated example in the case of energy. So I encourage you all to look at that article if you haven't seen it, which can also be applied to other sectors as to what more government intervention can mean and what could offer in developing more just transitions and how it really is essential. Secondly, I think we really need a more inclusive and accessible approach at a scale not yet seen in Ireland. I think there's really a clear need for a more inclusive approach. So for instance, transitions at the moment, the approach is largely grants, the establishment of grants, which people can then apply to. And I really don't think this is fully accessible because of course there's barriers to participation in applying to grants, as well as them not fully covering the costs. In contrast, countries such as Germany, where I've done a lot of research, in their energy transition had feed-in tariffs, which guaranteed access to the grid for all players, and also guaranteed payment for 20 years for energy that could be fed back to the grid. So these were really importantly in redistributing control over the energy system and benefits of renewable generation. So the principles of low barriers to participation, inclusive and accessibility, and redistributing these power and benefits within the transition are key. So I think questions here to think about in relation to the groups that communities you're involved in when preparing, for example, towards the consultation are, who are the groups who could benefit most from the transition, and what approaches are needed by government to include them and make sure they benefit from transition processes. Finally, I think we need a more holistic approach. So really understanding of how interrelated different areas are, for example, housing, climate, and food. I think there's a need to shift from an extractivist way of thinking and developing the economy in Ireland at a fundamental level. So rather than, I think, incremental change and piece by piece development of regional retraining programs, for instance, I think what is needed is fundamentally a shift to appreciate the importance of well-being and social protections and social justice as the foundation for developing a just transition approach. So to conclude, I'd just like to end on a note of hope. So I've met so many people all around the world who care deeply about environmental issues and justice. And many of these people across the US, Europe, and at home here in Ireland are spending their time actively working to block extractivist approaches and working to more regenerative solutions. And they give me hope. I also have hope because I believe that policy hasn't truly even tried yet. And so there's so much potential for change if only climate issues and just transition were taken seriously and acted upon by government with bravery and vision. And to make sure that happens, we have a diverse and growing and long history of the success of people coming together in broad movements for justice at home here in Ireland and globally to show us the way forward in ensuring change. So I'd just like to thank all of you for the work you're doing in your communities, your interest in justice and commitment to it and the environment. And thank you very much for your time and listening. And I really look forward to discussing with you more in the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was absolutely brilliant and really wonderful to end on such a hopeful note, and a great reminder as well that it's so important for us to have vision, because you're completely right to say that policy hasn't even really tried yet. So the possibilities are actually really, really broad, and they're there for the taking. We have a couple of really interesting questions in the Q&A box. One of them has been answered by Barry in writing already, but I might read it out, Barry, if you don't mind, just in case others haven't seen that. So it's, are data centres compromising Ireland's ability to reduce its emissions?
So yeah, the answer's there in the Q&A, but basically in my view on this question, data centers are very large energy users. They run pretty much 24/7 and they use electricity, high quality version of energy. And Irish electricity is not zero carbon. I mean, it's the intensity has been improved in recent years due to deployment of wind in particular, but it's definitely not zero carbon. So our total consumption of electricity use has been increasing steadily in the last few years and is projected to increase even more in the next number of years, due specifically to the expansion of the data center sector. And I compare it to trying to run down an up escalator. We're trying to drive down the emissions intensity of electricity, but we're using more and more electricity. So the absolute emissions aren't going down nearly as fast as they need to be going down. Now, of course, there are good reasons to use energy. There are good reasons to use more energy. If we have more people and if people are in energy poverty, we should try and get electricity and other forms of energy to them. So there may be reasons to grow certain kinds of electricity demand. We want to electrify transport and heating. But are data centers a really good societal use of very restricted energy? Well, you'll have to come to your own conclusion on that, but I'm questioning it, put it that way.
Great. Thanks so much, Barry. And kind of related to this, Louise, there's a question here on whether there is a conflict between the urgency of climate action and the need for a just transition.
So I think there's a few, it's a good question, and I think it's a question facing a lot of policymakers at the moment. But I think if you subscribe to a just transition approach, And if you think about what a sustainable transition is, in my view, it cannot be detached from social justice. So like, not only from, like I talked about, it being the right thing to do, but also the pragmatic thing to do. Like, I think we so do ourselves a disservice. And, you know, based on my own research in Germany, inclusive approaches that bring citizens with you, are far more successful in the long term. So that's the kind of pragmatic side. But like I said, I really think fundamentally this is such an opportunity to address, you know, so many harms and injustices that have occurred in society. It can really be a vehicle for change. So my understanding is the transition is in that terms of that's social, fundamentally that's social transition, as well as it being, you know, sustainable. So I don't see there to be a conflict. I think there is a risk it will be framed as a conflict going forward as the climate crisis becomes more urgent. And Barry really well just described the way in which that's you know, becoming increasingly urgent, and we saw it even this summer. And that would be, I really think that's such dangerous territory if we start seeing just climate action and not the social justice dimension. And yeah, it would be the sort of things that would you know, really cause me a lot of worry, and a lot of other people I think who are working on this worry as to where we could go, where it would lead if we only thought about sustainability just in terms of action on climate change and technology and reducing emissions, what sort of harms that could potentially cause. And these would run along existing lines of injustice in society. So there'd be certain groups that would be disproportionately impacted, certain areas disproportionately impacted. So in my view, I think we really need to see them as both, and we need to increasingly articulate it as being, you know, the same thing, rather than being in conflict, and showing how they can, the social dimension and the climate or sustainability dimension fundamentally complement one another.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think on the point of energy poverty, that is very clear in that, you know, in taking action to address energy poverty, the government wouldn't only be protecting the rights of those who are energy poor. Those homes are also a source of emissions. And so by reducing the emissions of those households, we are protecting the rights of all citizens. So I think, yeah, there's lots of examples we could look at where applying a just transition approach and an inclusive approach actually is the most pragmatic way of dealing with this.
Yeah. And just briefly to say, sorry, there's been research also done on, you know, how inequality leads to sustainability issues, you know, so it's like there's established research there. It was by Fergus Green as one of the co-authors. I think it's open access, but anyway, there's a growing recognition that actually, you know, that dichotomy is a false dichotomy. It's a red herring. It's, you know, and yeah, they really have to be thought about together.
Definitely. There's another question here from Alison Gilliland. She says, I'm conscious of the overall global impact of emissions and that we must all work together to achieve reductions. How effective is the UNFCCC and its leaders in overseeing progress, supporting change, and holding countries to account? So I'll open it up to either of you to respond to that.
Well, I'll jump
go
in.
Ahead, Barry.
I'll jump in first, but Louise can add something, I'm sure. I said earlier, so the Paris Agreement is the current primary instrument under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I said it's a terrible agreement, but it's the only one we've got. So we definitely need to work it as hard as we possibly can. But for example, you know, the Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels. You know, the parties to the Framework Convention could not manage to agree to name the elephant in the room, which was fossil fuels. So, and this is a problem now. International, like the United Nations is the legacy of the Second World War. So it's the framework that was created to try and manage international affairs in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And it was probably as good as could be formulated at that time in that context. But the context we're now living in is completely different. So one could certainly make an argument that the entire United Nations is not fit for the purposes of addressing the global challenges we now face. But it's the only one we've got. So we're in this situation of a ship, you know, at sea in a storm, and we've sprung a leak. And ideally, you know, we'd start building a new ship to replace it, because this old ship is completely, you know, deteriorated and useless, but we're in the middle of the ocean in a storm. So we have to work with what we've got as best we can. So I'm not an expert in international relations. I'm not an expert in international diplomacy. What I do point at is, it seems to me like you will look, and I think in vain, at the last climate action plan to see what the responsibilities of the Department of Foreign Affairs are. You know, what is the Irish diplomatic focus? What are, you know, what do we see? And we act obviously as part of the European Union. The European Union acts collectively in part. The EU is a separate party to the Paris Agreement. The individual countries are parties in their own right. So we have a role to influence European Union policy. And I think it's fair to say that traditionally, we have been viewed as not very enthusiastic about climate action in the EU. There are certainly more progressive countries in the EU. So we have a role within the EU. We have a role internationally. We have the Irish diaspora. So I think the main criticism I would make in the Irish case is we're just not asking ourselves where we should be applying and how much resource we should be applying. I mean, I think every Irish embassy around the world should have 2 or 3 or 4 people exclusively dedicated to climate diplomacy. But that would only work if there was a clear agenda for climate diplomacy coming from Ireland, if we knew what it was we were trying to achieve and how we were trying to achieve it. And we haven't even started to have that conversation.
Thanks, Barry. Did you want to comment on that one, Louise?
Yeah, I think following on what Barry was saying, I think the UNFCCC is really best understood as a highly political entity, and anything that comes out of it has to be kind of understood in that context. So, you know, like as Barry said, the 1.5 degrees limit on warming, like that's not a safe limit. You know, the political processes within the UN lead it that it's rather conservative and rather politically decided decisions rather than scientifically decided decisions, which also, you know, really disproportionately affect certain areas of the globe when we're thinking about, you know, climate justice and areas that have least contributed to the problem. You know, 1.5, you know, Ireland might do okay, but like, you know, we already see what's happening in the Horn of Africa, in places like Pakistan. As Barry said really clearly in his talk, you know, people are already being affected. And I don't really think the processes of the UNFCCC accurately reflect that, because it's so highly political and the decisions that they come to in the policy documents. And of course, there's the massive role of lobbying of fossil fuel industries and other vested interests that really, I think, significantly derail and just kind of limit how much promise that scope could hold, and have all sorts of impacts in terms of, you know, what's considered appropriate, what's considered possible, you know, the lack of inclusion of proper discussion of loss and damage or of Indigenous rights and protections of their land. You know, so a whole host of things I think are really, really important things are left outside of the frame of reference. And, you know, Barry mentioned kind of degrowth in his talk. And I think the last document that came out maybe hinted at degrowth. So there's some sort of recognition of this societal change that's needed, but I think it's really underappreciated. And so, like Barry said, you know, in one way, it's the only international agreement we have, and I've heard it quite well described by an activist once as, you know, kind of a hook on which we can hang our demands. And I really think that's a function it can serve, but that's probably maybe, you know, and in that regard, I would place a lot more hope on the kind of bottom-up movements that are taking place as a way in which we can further, you know, a more justice-centered approach to sustainability and dealing with the climate issue, both nationally but also at a global level.
Thanks so much, Louise, and thanks so much to our audience. We have so many really brilliant questions coming in, and we actually only have 5 minutes left, so we're going to do our best to go through them as quickly as we can. There's one person who has commented here asking how what we have heard today can we put in a way that is relevant and understandable to the masses, otherwise we have lost them. I completely agree, Sarah, and we had at Community Law and Mediation hoped to provide a better guide to this consultation, but just because it was running through August, with people taking annual leave and with a very tight deadline, and we weren't able to facilitate that this year, but we'll make this recording available as soon as possible, and we'll share it with everybody. Michelle, there's a question here from Michelle Murphy, who asks, Louise, could you please comment on the universal energy credit of €200 from a social justice perspective, given that it looks like it will be repeated again as a once-off cost of living measure?
Yeah, so I think, as I kind of said in my, alluded to in my talk, I think these sort of measures, like we have to, rather than piece by piece addressing impacts of the transition, or for example, addressing impacts of the carbon tax, you know, to make sure that it's not impacting certain groups or increasing energy poverty, I think we need to kind of shift, rather than having a system a certain way or the approach a certain way, that we then have to do these retrospective measures to always kind of address the impacts. I think we need to start really fundamentally thinking, as Claude said in the introduction, about social justice as really the foundation upon which we can then build climate action. And that means looking across, like the great work, as Claude was talking about, that they're doing on energy poverty, housing. You know, obviously a lot of the talk around climate action is about engaging citizens and, you know, activating local communities. But like if people are in insecure housing, you know, they're not going to be able to have the scope to participate in climate action. So what I'm trying to get at here is, I think these measures, you know, as emergency measures, okay, maybe they're needed in the moment, but we really need to, there's going to be so many transformations happening. There's going to be so many costs. It's not just about work programs in the Midlands. It's at a fundamental level, our society completely has to transition. And unless we start developing that social floor within which people are secure and have a meaningful standard of living, upon which to then make those transitions to say people are safe and secure in their housing and their access to food and their access to energy, it will give us so much more scope and maneuverability in developing the transition, as well as really protecting people and making sure that we embed social justice. So it's a really fundamental shift that I think needs to happen, rather than these kind of, you know, emergency measures as these issues come up, because there's going to be many more. So we better rather just get the foundation set and then build upon that for a more just and sustainable society.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Louise. Okay, we're going to take just 2 more questions in 2 minutes. So is there any scope to reduce demand, I guess that's energy demand, by banning cryptocurrency mining or targeted advertising on Facebook, etc.? Barry, would you have any views on that one?
As far as we know, there isn't a lot of cryptocurrency mining going on in Ireland. In fact, electricity is too expensive here for it to make sense. So that in itself, in the Irish context, and it's a difficult technically, you know, to ban a specific activity like that, because you have to detect it first. But so that one possibly not. Facebook advertising, well, you see, my view on that is we could do with an awful lot less advertising, full stop. That would help enormously. We have way too much advertising. And it's not because advertising in and of itself uses a lot of energy, although it does. I mean, a significant amount of this data center activity is precisely about, because most of these companies are actually, their business model is advertising. The way they make money is by mining, in a different sense, your attention, stealing your time, and steering you towards buying products. And that's the business model. So it all starts with advertising as a product in its own right, but it's advertising on steroids, as it were. But you know, are we as a society ready to step back far enough to think about the consumerist nature of our society, and the way that's in the background? I mean, it's like the fish in water doesn't realize it's in water, you know, because it's all around. And we are immersed in consumerism, and consumerism as a mark of status in society. And we're hardwired as human beings to be sensitive to social status. And what these, particularly the most recent social media approaches to advertising, are doing is basically hijacking our social status neural pathways, and it's just, you know, but it's a bigger discussion and it's hard to surface. But we have banned certain forms of advertising already, because we could see the clear negative society-wide impacts of that. So I think there is scope to extend that, but it's not because the advertising in itself is using so much energy. It's because the consumption of the goods and services that are being advertised are energy intensive in many cases. We could start with the most energy intensive, like, you know, weekend holidays in wherever, the other side of the world, or you know, hugely disproportionately large private cars or whatever. There are certain kinds of products that are particularly energy intensive that we could certainly look at the advertising of.
Thank you, Barry. And then for a very last question, Louise, I'll ask you to try and answer this as quickly as you can. Someone has asked that they really like the idea, it's from Isabel Kenny, that she really likes the idea of moving from an extractive to a regenerative economy. Like, are there some practical examples of what that might look like in practice?
Yeah, so I mean, I think right now the way we're approaching the transition is in quite an extractivist way. So, you know, in the case of Ireland, I'm being broad and abstract here because of time, but, you know, there's a lot of, for example, wind energy development, like I mentioned, which are external to communities. Communities haven't chosen it. It's private actors coming in, building massive wind turbine projects, with communities, you know, not consulted and not getting any benefits. You know, it's not even energy for them. It's energy, for example, like Barry mentioned, to service data centers in urban centers. And that's an extractivist way of doing it. Whereas in places like Leitrim, you know, they have incredible projects going on that are already very sustainable and already show us signs of the regenerative economy, like sustainable tourism, you know, place-based local economies, art, culture. They've all these things on offer. And I'm talking to Leitrim because it's where I'm doing my research at the moment. But I think there's examples all across Ireland, which are place-based, chosen by the community, have all those elements of regenerative economy and show us the way. They're already existing. We don't have to worry that the solutions aren't yet there. We can look on the ground at what's happening, and people all around Ireland, all around the globe, are already developing these regenerative solutions that are place-based, local, decided by local communities, and suit the local, you know, both social and environmental well-being. And I think these need to be honoured and protected and supported, rather than this extractivist approach, which is directly in contrast to and undermining these approaches that already are emerging. So there's already many examples. I had to be short, but I think they're already there. And it's really that idea of community ownership, local place-based economy, shifting from this idea that people and places are resources to extract value from, but rather these more regenerative practices that heal and repair and foster social and environmental well-being.
Thank you so much. I think that's such a wonderful note to end on. People have the answers and people have knowledge, and our communities have knowledge. And so please, please do have your say in this consultation. The link to the survey can be found in the chat box, and the link to the call for expert evidence can also be found there too. If you have any questions, please email info@communitylowmediation.ie. We'll make the recording available on our website, and we'll share that on all social media as soon as we possibly can. I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we didn't get to answer. We'll just have to bring Louise and Barry back another time. But thanks so much to you both for your really amazing contributions and for all the brilliant work that you're both doing. And thanks so much to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.